and welcome
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you, ma'am, and a warm welcome to everyone. Today's session, as ma'am has said, has been titled Modeling Development, Kerala on the Global Stage. Our speaker for today is Professor Lukose, who is an associate professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study, New York University. With a background in anthropology, Professor Lukose's current work explores the rise of the gender and development paradigm within the international system, starting in the 1970s, exploring how it came to prominence in the fluid trajectories of decolonization and the rise of neoliberalism. Her book, Liberalization's Children, Gender, Youth and Consumer Citizenship in Globalizing India, was published by Duke University Press in 2009 and co-published in India by Orient Black Swan in 2010. A co-edited book, South Asian Feminisms, was published by Duke University Press and Zuban. I now invite Professor Lukose to please talk.
Okay, so first of all, I really want to thank Navanita, Papuri, Malika, Ritty, for organizing this. The center has always been a source of great inspiration and intellectual community, and I'm really glad to be back to share some of my work with you. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? No?
Louder.
A little louder. Okay. There's a weird kind of static. Oh, which stopped. Okay. Thank you. That's a little better. Okay. So I have a prepared presentation, and I've got a lot to get through. I'm hoping I'll stick to the time. So I'm just going to go ahead. So this presentation and the larger project that frames it is concerned with debates within feminism, engaging with the unease, disquiet, and worry within feminist scholarship and politics about feminism's putative success. This success is, of course, complicated, framed by backlash and riven with internal contestations. But it is relatively clear, I think, that the idea of feminism, notions of women's empowerment and gender, in all its multifarious iterations, is alive in the world, ambivalently, variously understood within the horizon of whatever one means by the word feminism. This has led to much hand-wringing within feminist communities. For example, while the feminist critical theorist Nancy Fraser has explored how neoliberalism has created a dangerous liaison between feminism and neoliberalism, diffusing the radical currents of second-wave feminism in the US, in a range of work within South Asia and elsewhere, activists and scholars seem to be persistently charting the pernicious effects of gender mainstreaming, marketization through microfinance, NGOization, and the contradictions of state-sponsored gender empowerment. Optimistic accounts of transnational activism and solidarity sit alongside anxious reflections about the entangled relations between local, national, and global reconfigurations. Sometimes these debates descend into accusations of complicity with hegemonic forces, variously named, while others worry about depoliticization, assimilation, and incorporation into dominant institutions and structures. If the question of feminism in the last several years seems to have become more urgent than ever, perhaps belying simple narratives of feminist success, that urgency, I would argue, is elaborated against the backdrop of a vexed conversation about the proliferation of some of feminism's key concepts and claims. Now, stepping back from our contemporary hand-wringing about where feminists find themselves, this project engages this problematic by suggesting that attention to how women and gender emerged within the international system starting in the 1970s might enable a more critical apprehension of our present. To that end, I explore some strands in globally circulating discourses about women and gender to better understand how a focus on women and then gender gains traction and becomes productive for the evolving international system, dominated in large part by the paradigm of development in the 1970s and 80s, one which arguably shifts to violence against women starting in the 1990s. This is obviously an enormously complicated set of issues with many different strands. Often it is told as a heroic story about feminist activism at the international level, an international women's movement asserting itself within and outside the UN system. Part of this project is interested in the dynamics of how that begins to happen in the 1970s. What happens when American and European feminism across the East-West divide turn towards the international? What are the struggles between Northern feminists and Southern ones within the UN system? How has the rise of women and gender within the UN system been shaped by contending voices within a feminist horizon? What are the relations between ideas, institutions, and practices that create what we might now call a global gender infrastructure? The larger project revisits key figures, writing largely from third world locations, their intellectual and political trajectories, their scholarly contributions, such as those of Esther Boserup and her seminal text, Women's Role in Economic Development, Maria Mies, her writings, but also her important role in the institutionalization of the women and development paradigm, Kumari Jayawardana's Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World, which I read as a reaction to the rise of the women and development paradigm, and the important intervention of Dawn in the 1980s, the network of feminist scholar activists from the Global South that produced vigorous critiques of structural adjustment from a Southern feminist location. Tracing the intellectual histories of these figures and their texts, I hope to better understand what horizons of hope and possibility animated a turn towards the international within the dynamics of the 1970s and 80s. However, I am also interested in a more top-down story as it relates to this bottom-up perspective, and that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. How and when and why does the category of woman become productive for an evolving international system? This is, of course, an old story. Gender discourse is part and parcel of a colonial civilizing mission, the rise of a variety of imperial feminisms, complex rearticulations of different kinds of feminisms and internationalisms from the 19th century onwards, particularly interesting during the interwar years, which have shaped the post-war period in interesting ways. What particularly interests me in the 1970s is the 1970s and the confluence, overlap, dissonance between the rise of what we may call neoliberalism, the fluidities of decolonization, and the rise of the woman question within this international system. Now, coming out of my earlier work in Kerala, this presentation explores these questions in a preliminary way by tracking how the Kerala model of development came into being and has been taken up globally. This model, as many of you know, constructs Kerala as a highly developed state that treats its women well, an exceptional bastion of gender equality. This presentation tracks shifts within international development discourse that create the context in and through which this model is constructed and circulated. My hope is that this mapping will illuminate in a very preliminary way some evolving connections between gender, neoliberalism, and internationalism that might have some implications for how we think about the present. Now, anyone, and I'm sure many of you know this, reading Indian newspapers and many international ones, beginning in July and August of 2013, would have been hard-pressed to miss the mass-mediated public war of words between economist Jagdish Bhagwati and Amartya Sen. Framed as the growth versus development debate, some commentators understood the media spectacle through a lens that emphasized the long-standing and rather bitter personal and intellectual rivalry between two giants in the field of trade and welfare economics. With titles like Gandhi versus Modi is actually Sen versus Bhagwati, their differences over India's economic policies were seen as a foreshadowing of the choices before voters for potential prime ministerial candidates of the Congress and the BJP, which of course the BJP won. Now, coming on the heels of the publication of their books, their public debate was also recast as the Gujarat versus Kerala debate. Bhagwati, of course, has written and spoken approvingly of Modi's economics, one that has emphasized rapid economic growth, defined in terms of a rising output of goods and services through private entrepreneurship, which they argue will lead to revenues necessary for better development outcomes in education, healthcare, and the like. Amartya Sen has, for many years now, been speaking of the Kerala experience. He doesn't like the word model, which he sees as an instantiation of his capabilities approach to development, in which redistribution of social services like education and healthcare is emphasized before an attention to economic growth. In this most recent book, he argues that India's post-liberalization economic growth has led to an abysmal record of development. While he has long stated that economic growth is important for bettering people's lives, he argues what is needed is redistribution, not only of income, but of public goods for eradicating illiteracy, ill health, and malnutrition. Along with countries like Japan, Singapore, China, and Korea, Kerala is held up as proof that such a path works. As I'm sure we are all aware, such a framing of economic and development policy is a long-standing one, both within intellectual, political, and institutional policy realms, with many iterations and manifestations. The persistence with which this binary is invoked begs for a conjunctural analysis, the what, when, why of its invocations. For example, in 2013, Modi's championing of the Gujarat model versus the Kerala model was, one might argue, a brilliant techno-political move, capitalizing on the rise of technocratic understandings of development within neoliberal India to trump the anti-communal arguments against his candidacy, given his role in the Gujarat pogroms. While we debate Gujarat versus Kerala, the technopolitics of development proceeds, depoliticizing profoundly political maneuvers. Such a framing of what is essentially an argument about economic policy has interesting resonances within critical intellectual understandings of our present. It is, of course, apparent that this growth versus development debate is a debate about neoliberalism. James Ferguson, reflecting on what he calls the uses of neoliberalism in anthropology, questions the widespread denunciatory rhetoric of much anthropological work that fashions itself as a politicized critique of neoliberalism, which seems to demonstrate with depressing regularity that the rich are benefiting and the poor are, in his words, getting screwed. Rather than expressing indignation or simply denouncing the powerful, he would like us to engage the question of, quote, what we want, to be, quote, pro and not simply anti. Along these lines, he in fact invokes Amartya Sen's critique of global food distribution programs and his alternative policy prescriptions as one example of how anthropologists might provide not simply negative critique, but positive policy prescriptions. Now, I'm very sympathetic to a project that seeks to move from straightforward denunciations of neoliberalism to engaging the difficult task of thinking new progressive possibilities, given our existing context. He is also surely right to argue that simply asserting revolutionary utopian alternatives is not enough. However, our sense of alternative progressive possibilities cannot be simply a matter of asserting in some narrow way that something that we think of as bad policy might be good policy. Surely the kind of rethinking that is called for requires some attention to the ways our political horizons are shaped and in turn frame our engagements with our sense of the possible. To this end, how we tell the story of neoliberalism's unfolding, its historicity, might matter for how we understand the choices before us. Paying attention to what has fallen by the wayside and what has congealed as our sense of our present in our meta narratives might also provide some resources for rethinking. Framings such as Gujarat versus Kerala or Bhagwati versus Sen or growth versus development are of course simplified binaries that shape discourse and politics in a variety of ways. It's interesting to note that the Kerala model emerged as an alternative model in the mid-1970s at precisely the time that most accounts of neoliberalism begin. What can we learn by examining the ways this model emerged in the 1970s and the way it gets mobilized today? What was this model an alternative to in the 1970s, and what is it an alternative to now? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kerala model. The construction of Kerala as a model for development can be traced to 1975 with the publication of a report very prosaically titled Poverty, Unemployment, and Development Policy, a case study of selected issues with references to Kerala, prepared by the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. In the wide-ranging literature on Kerala's development experience, it is this report that congeals and lays bare the main elements of what is called the Kerala model. After analysis of food intake and availability, as well as unemployment and wages, in the conclusion of the report, authored by the economist and founding director of the center, K. and Raj drew attention to some paradoxical features of development in Kerala. Despite having a very low per capita income, among the lowest in India, very high rates of poverty, 48% based on the definition of poverty measured by food intake, extremely high levels of unemployment, and very low levels of industrialization and economic growth. Kerala had the highest rate of literacy and school enrollments among males and females, the longest expectancy of life, a declining birth rate, and low levels of infant and maternal mortality, making it an outlier within the Indian context. The study went on to, and I'm sure many of you know this, the study went on to detail the importance of several public distribution programs adopted by the state and their impact. Land reform reduced inequality in the distribution of land and income accruing from it. A public food distribution system that reached the rural poor and not just urban populations. High levels of literacy and school enrollments, which emphasizes not only historical causes, but also the contemporary educational system that focused on primary schooling and not higher education. And a healthcare system spread thinly that reached a wide swathe of the population. Now, this report was important within the state for reconfiguring Kerala's evolving regional identity. If contemporary brochures by the State Tourism Board will juxtapose images of women in traditionally coated saris, lighting the traditional nelavelaka or lamp with text that proclaims Kerala to be the most advanced state in India with 100% literacy. In the early to mid 1970s, Kerala was shaped by another strand of the dominant development discourse, namely the ticking time bomb of the population explosion as one of the most densely populated regions in the world. This image of an overpopulated, overwhelmingly poor region was often linked to the construction of Kerala as a political outlier, having freely elected a communist government in 1957, full of radical peasant and labor militancy. The report did much to produce and consolidate a state-centric discourse of a modernizing left developmentalism in the face of a fractious and tumultuous post-independence political trajectory. Now, this left developmentalism emerged in and through the articulation of region and nation in an international development regime. While the report drew on students and faculty of Kerala's higher educational institutions for expertise and research assistance, the report was commissioned by the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs, paying CDS $15,000 US dollars, an important sum as the institution was struggling to build its campus. This entity within the UN system focuses on norm setting through facilitating the major UN conferences, for example, and policy analysis about the development pillar of the UN. It targets governments and NGOs for the dissemination of its analysis and policy recommendations. But one of its major tasks is also to support deliberations about development in the UN General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council. It is the lead author department of the UN Secretariat, producing flagship publications and reports essential to UN negotiations and global policy decisions. Under the auspices of the Second United Nations Development Decade, 1971 to 80, the General Assembly modified its methods to focus on major problems and decided to commission work from outside the UN system to develop development policy recommendations. The Kerala report came under the rubric of mass poverty and unemployment in the developing world. Therefore, this entity produces knowledge for dissemination within key entities of the UN system and outside, and the leveraging of the Kerala model owes much to the institutional context within the UN system through which the 1975 report was published. But this left developmentalism did not simply emerge through a direct connection between Kerala and the UN system. K.N. Raj, which I'm sure many of you know, was one of India's most accomplished development economists who played a key role within the planning process in India over many decades. And he positioned CDS as a key node that articulated region, nation, and the international system within the evolving post-war development apparatus. Raj, variously described as a Keynesian and Marxist economist who sought to apply Keynesian economics to agrarian societies, was a colleague and peer of Jagdish Bhagwati, Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh. He was obviously a force behind the setting up of the Delhi School of Economics, drawing the likes of Sen and Bhagwati to the institution. And after a rather disastrous turn as vice chancellor of Delhi University in the late 1960s, welcomed the opportunity presented by Achyuta Menon to found the center in his home state. It is partly the relationship between Raj and Sen that explains why Sen has been on the governing body of CDS from its inception, visited the state more than 20 times, written about and invoked Kerala as an alternative and embodiment of his capabilities approach to development for decades, creating an association between Sen and the state that enabled the Kerala governor and chancellor of the university to declare in a ceremony in 2000 in the capital city honoring Sen after receiving his Nobel Prize, and I quote, "By honoring you, Amartya Sen, we are honoring ourselves." So I'm now going to move to talk a little bit about the broader ideological context of the 1970s to sort of position the Kerala report. As many of us are aware, the growth versus distribution framing is ensconced within a broader and long-standing developmental discourse about the best way to achieve a higher standard of living for the poor of developing countries, fueling the invention of poverty in the making of the third world, as Arturo Escobar famously argued from the context of Latin America. There is, of course, a growing literature that examines the evolving post-war international system and the rise and consolidation of a development apparatus, importantly linking geopolitics and critical histories of the social sciences in an attempt to contextualize the connections between knowledge projects, institutions, and development practice within broader histories. Within the UN system, accounts of the unfolding of development policy proceeds through a historical narrative that ties shifts in policy to UN decades and the institutional mechanisms through which policy is evaluated, debated, learned from, revised, and reissued within changing world realities. For example, the UN Intellectual History Project, a now concluded project to consolidate the contribution of the UN to the world of ideas, has published several volumes detailing such processes. Now, within the realm of development, the 1950s is understood as the high water mark of what is today self-consciously understood as a Eurocentric modernization theory, preoccupied as it was with the bifurcation of developing societies into modern and traditional sectors where the impediments to economic, social, and political development lay. The single dominant answer for how one moved from tradition to modernity was industrialization, framed through the Cold War rhetoric and imperatives pitting capitalist industrialization against what was construed as an authoritarian communist model. Much development thinking of the 1950s, therefore, was about how to produce the capital necessary for push and takeoff of industrialization. While modernization theory understood this in terms of the lag between tradition and modernity within societies shaped by Cold War understandings of those societies, the 1950s was also the birth of center-periphery analysis within the UN system through the work of Raul Prebisch and Hans Singer within the context, speaking from the context of Latin America. They argued that the benefits to productivity from technical progress due to industrialization within developed countries accrued to developed countries, whereas within peripheral economies, they also accrued to developed countries. This left little room for industrialization within Latin America, as it was stuck producing food and raw materials for the center. While this was a very different analysis than the Cold War rhetoric of American-generated views of modernization, it arrived at the same conclusion: the importance of state-led industrialization for escaping this trap. From the beginning, a major axis for understanding the articulation of development discourse is the dynamic between state and market within a society in relation to the position of that society within the international system. If modernization theory understood the latter through notions of lag and the need to catch up, center-periphery analysis configured the internal inequalities within states in relation to a structurally hierarchical international system. Now, the 1960s was officially named the Decade of Development by US President John Kennedy, arguing in the UN General Assembly in 1961, and I quote here, "Political sovereignty is but a mockery without the means of meeting poverty and illiteracy and disease. Self-determination is but a slogan if the future holds no hope." Here, of course, Kennedy nods to the tumultuous events marking decolonization around the world, self-determination, political sovereignty, while re-articulating and reasserting international developmentalist visions. Shifting away from takeoff and push theories, the decade began with the slogan, "Growth plus change." Through much argumentation, the focus became achieving targets of economic growth through effective national planning, with a new elaboration of development beyond wealth to include the social, encompassing conditions of life and broad aspirations. And here I'm sort of taking terms coming out of this rhetoric and discourse. For example, while the major impediment to industrialization was understood to be capital in the previous decade, it was education and human resources in the development decade. Of course, this focus on the social was not simply about learning more about development and forming a deeper understanding, as the rhetoric would have it. This elaboration of the social was shaped by the geopolitics of the Cold War and hedging bets against more radical claims on the part of developing nations. As the decade wore on, it became clear that the confident assertions about inevitable social outcomes of economic development were not bearing fruit. The UN's focus on integrated national planning as the mechanism for producing development was supplemented by the creation of the Center for Development Planning in 1966, the entity that commissioned the Kerala report, suggesting that national planning capacities of governments were overly technocratic, divorced from political realities, and perhaps too top-down. The CDP stepped back from the integrated national planning modality to focus on issues such as mass poverty and unemployment, the framing for the Kerala report. By the end of the decade, it was clear within the UN system that economic progress did not automatically lead to improved living conditions for the mass of people, something that would nevertheless be asserted in the 1980s as the mantra of structural adjustment. Now, institutional histories of the UN marked the 1970s, the official decade of development, as the decade of equity, marking a shift from the preoccupation with growth and transforming an elaboration of the social into a problematic about equity. Now, what is interesting about the focus on equity is the particular bundling of different senses of equity: equity between socioeconomic groups, equity between the North and the South, and importantly, equity between men and women, at precisely the time that neoliberal restructuring begins. The immediate context of the Kerala report is what is increasingly understood to be the lack of the trickle-down effect of growth-oriented understandings of development, hence the interest in a model where there is social development without economic growth. However, to narrowly frame the uptake of the CDS authored report in terms of a top-down versus bottom-up, growth versus redistribution debate, at a moment when equity was emerging at the expense of growth within the international system, elided some crucial contextualization within the fraught politics of the 1970s. We must ask what equity has to do with an emergent neoliberal order. Now, the emergence of this preoccupation with equity emerged just as neoliberal doctrine was emerging. Standard accounts of the emergence of neoliberalism, such as that of David Harvey, tells a story about how it was experimented with during the New York municipal crisis and with crucial elaborations in Chile, Britain, Reagan's America, before being exported via the IMF to the rest of the world. As Vijay Prashad argues, and I quote, "What this misses is the necessary demise of the Third World Project, and so the opening up of the countries of the South to the new geography of production." Now, the Third World Project, of course, is enormously complex, involving the variegated histories of decolonization within the evolving post-war international system. New work on Bandung and the emergence and articulation of NAM, the non-aligned movement, have begun to shift the focus of our understanding from dominant Cold War framings to a more complex understanding of the relationship between East-West logics as they overlap with North-South wranglings and the legacies of those struggles for our contemporary context. To that end, I highlight one aspect of this struggle, namely the new International Economic Order, the NIEO, which was passed by the UN General Assembly in 1974, the year before the Kerala report was published. At one level, one can view the passage of the NIEO as the culmination and perhaps height of the Third World Project. Its immediate context was both economic and political. The imperialistic Vietnam War signaled what could be accomplished in fighting the greatest power on earth. This is the rhetoric of the NIEO, mobilizing support for third world victims of imperialism and colonialism, both in the North and the South. Most importantly for the NIEO, the oil crisis was defining, demonstrating that countries in the South, albeit rich countries in the South, could band together to make Western industrial economies vulnerable. The thinking behind the NIEO was, of course, older. Drawing on the intellectual resources of the various conferences and platforms created at Bandung and other NAM events and writings, the NIEO was most directly influenced by the creation of UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, in 1964, and the Group of 77, with its formulation of a unified Third World understanding of international political economy. Drawing on the center periphery framework of Raul Prebisch, the General Secretary of the 1964 UNCTAD meeting, the NIEO was understood as a, quote, revolt of the Third World, one that indicted the current economic order for emerging prior to the era of decolonization within an extractive imperial economic system. Growing interdependence between North and South necessitated a robust recognition of the sovereign equality of states in which developing countries should be full participants in decision-making at the international level. The issue here is, of course, the place of the nation state. The self-reliance and dependency theory perspectives certainly influenced the rhetoric of the NIEO, but their mapping pitted a predatory and unequal international system against the nation. While the NIEO drew on that mapping, it also sought to remap the international itself through its emphasis on the sovereign equality of nations, drawing on liberal internationalist notions of interdependence and cooperation to push back against the blatant hierarchy of nations within the international system. Now, an important element of the NIEO was the way this assertion of the sovereign equality of nations within the international system configured the internal economic workings of each nation. An important assertion and platform of the NIEO was the sovereign and inalienable right of every state, and I quote here, to choose its economic system as well as its political, social, and cultural system in accordance with the will of its people without outside interference, coercion, or threat in any form whatsoever, unquote. This kind of rhetoric, of course, speaks to the ways in which the non-aligned movement sought to produce neutrality within Cold War configurations. It also reveals the ways in which, in the mid-1970s, it was still possible to imagine, however ambiguously, different styles of development. Now, the paradoxical features of Kerala's development experience that were highlighted by K. N. Raj, low income and growth versus high achievements in life expectancy and low mortality, were rendered in a decidedly national frame by Raj. Other than references to the problems and issues of the developing world in the preface of the report, every table in the report places Kerala in relation to other states within India. However, the report began to circulate globally at a time when the international development apparatus was shifting from a focus on growth measured by wealth and income to an emergent understanding of equity measured in terms of well-being. In this context, the dominance of measures such as the gross national product began to be challenged. Encouraged by friends within UNICEF and at the formal behest of the Overseas Development Council, when the Brown sociologist Morris D. Morris began his work in the mid-1970s to create what came to be known as the Physical Quality of Life Index when it was published in 1979 as a counter to the GNP, Kerala became increasingly modeled through an international comparative grid. As the Physical Quality of Life Index transformed into the Human Development Index by 1990, something Amartya Sen was involved in, Kerala was firmly ensconced in an international developmentalist grid. It was persistently highlighted as a stark example of the divergence between GNP and PQLI and HDI. The status of Kerala as a region is a notable feature of its codification and circulation. From the PQLI to the HDI and beyond, Kerala is the only non-sovereign nation that is highlighted. A good sense of this comes from Amartya Sen's own writings that have been highlighting Kerala for over 30 years in his many publications. If one simply looks at Development as Freedom, his most popular synthesis, where Kerala features prominently throughout the text, it's interesting to note the ways in which Kerala is often invoked alongside Sri Lanka and China as demonstrating the divergence between income and development. While Kerala is most often linked to these two countries, it's also sometimes placed alongside Jamaica and Costa Rica, depending on the indicators discussed. Recognizing the anomaly that Kerala is in this respect, Sen states, and I quote, Kerala is of course not a country, but a state within one. However, with its population of 29 million, which of course it's about 33 million now, it would have been one of the larger countries in the world, rather larger than Canada, had it been a country on its own. So its experience is not negligible, unquote. Now, quite apart from the size of its population, I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons Kerala is so productive within international development discourse is precisely because of its non-sovereign character as a region within a nation being compared to other sovereign nations. The Kerala report emerged at a moment when the shift from growth to equity, primarily understood within national terms as a problem of inequality within nations, became entangled with a contested battle about equality between nations, framed by a third worldist perspective that in the 1970s articulated a variety of developmentalist visions linked to centralized planning processes with varying degrees of allegiance to something called socialism. When Kerala's communist past was invoked as an exemplary instance of what could be achieved in a poor third world region through socialist inspired mobilizations, it was important that it had not led to a full-scale revolution that had achieved sovereignty, i.e. the specter of Cuba. It could point to multiple styles of development without commitment to a particular revolutionary trajectory. As several accounts have detailed, the defeat of the Third World Project does not simply happen as a corollary to the rise of neoliberalism within the economic sphere. The restructurings of regulatory regimes necessary for transforming the flows of capital was a bitter and contested battle within the international system in which the G7 won at the expense of the G77. As the 1970s wore on, the articulation of the South as a unified entity began to fail, very self-consciously produced by, very subconsciously undone through various strategies of divide and conquer on the part of the global North. Ironically, while OPEC and the oil crisis might have given birth to a new confidence that enabled the passage of the NIEO in 1974, it was the circulation of those same petrodollars through the Western banking system that fueled the emergence of the debt crisis and structural adjustment of third world economies in the 1980s. So now I'm going to turn to what all of this might have to do with gender equality and feminism. Now, given the rise of the neoliberal consensus and the overthrow of the sovereign equality of nations, in which the internal functioning of a nation states are not off the table, as the NIEO asserted, it's interesting to note how Kerala is mobilized within this new dispensation. Again, Sen is useful in this regard. And one of the pillars of the capabilities approach is the importance and value of freedom, substantively understood as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. In other words, substantive freedoms that produce the capabilities necessary for individuals to exercise agency that can be applied to ends that they determine. The exercise of this individual agency is firmly linked to markets naturalized as good and necessary within a post-Cold War horizon. Within this context, Sen argues for the centrality of democracy as a political system for mediating market mechanisms. Rather than assert the right of sovereign nations to determine their own cultural, political, and economic systems through multiple styles of development, Sen argues for a particular set of values, freedom and agency, realized through markets mediated by capitalist democracies. It's not only the discrepancy between income and development that makes Kerala interesting for Sen. Linking literacy, education, and what he calls public action, Sen persistently highlights the agency of women in Kerala as a prime example of the importance of democracy and freedom for development outcomes. For example, Kerala has a fertility rate that is well below that of China, but has achieved this by creating new values rather than coercion. High levels of female literacy have made debate and dialogue possible through public discussion, which has produced the idea in Kerala that, quote, a happy family in the modern age is a small family. This focus on high rates of female literacy, which produce public discussion that leads to low fertility and birth rates, is then seamlessly understood as an expression of women's agency and empowerment, demonstrating the centrality and vitality of agency and empowerment for good development outcomes. The contrast with the 1975 report is instructive. Primarily interested in the problems of widespread unemployment, the report, in a very, very delimited way, understands education as a means to a competitive advantage over others in a limited job market and speculates that it might promote mobility and migration, which of course it certainly did. Female education correlates with better nutrition and utilization of health services that increases exposure to family planning programs that in turn lowers fertility and mortality. There is no claim being made here about freedom, women's agency, and empowerment. The entire thrust of the report is to assess the public distribution programs, land reform, food distribution, education and healthcare, and their effectiveness. The differential centrality of land in the report's and Sen's account is striking. The report focuses on the impact of land reform on food intake, nutrition levels, and the like, while for Sen, even land emerges as an instance of women's empowerment because of a generalized notion that women of the Nair caste had some rights to property within the matrilineal system. Therefore, the folding of Kerala's development profile into a very, very large story about women's agency and empowerment in Sen's work demonstrates how the rise of a global discourse about women shapes Sen's account of Kerala's development experience. Now, if the dynamics of development in Kerala were forged in the 1970s through an articulation between region, nation, and globe, it is no less true today, but under radically altered circumstances. In the aftermaths of 1989 and a sense of accelerated capitalist globalization, the CPM successfully instituted, after some internal contestation, what is called the People's Plan in the 1990s. One that was about decentralization of decision-making about development initiatives and was a bit more open to what was called civil society organizations. The global governance regime, for which the people matter more than the state, has been very dynamically engaged with by the state government, with local governance and participatory democracy being widely and deeply institutionalized. Within this discourse, of course, and many of you know this, nothing is more crucial than the agency and empowerment of women. Incorporated into the development apparatus, when governmentalized feminism came to Kerala in the late 1990s, it came fairly easily. The gender mainstreaming agenda of the 1995 Beijing conference linked up with democratic decentralization to widen women's access to both to development, politics, and access to welfare provisions. Whatever some unintended consequences of governmentalized feminism in Kerala today, it is clear that this new iteration of gender and development in Kerala has emerged through a governance paradigm that seeks to address inequalities within nations with no need to pay attention to the equality between nations. As the Third World Project was waning, the reconfigurations of the social that emerged in the 1960s that transformed into ideas about equity in the 1970s, variously understood, has been importantly reconfigured as a gendered space, peopled by individual women in the third world exercising their agency and empowerment. I'm now going to conclude. Of course, we now live within decidedly post-national horizons. Those horizons have been shaped crucially by important feminist critiques of the nation state. As we now wrestle with gender mainstreaming and the depoliticizing effects of NGOization, it might be important to think more critically about some of the unintended consequences of feminism's understandably vexed relationship to state sovereignty, either of the national or the interstate variety. For example, Dawn articulated its critique of the nation states to which its scholars, activists spoke from, while drawing on third world internationalist visions of the non-aligned variety to critique the dominant international order while being ambivalently incorporated into the vision of non-alignment, given the ways in which non-alignment was so statist. As Devaki Jain once characterized it, the relationship between NAM and the women's movement was a very tentative and ambivalent walking together. Now, in her attempt to rethink feminism's productivity for neoliberalism, Nancy Fraser posits a post-Westphalian transnational framework for rethinking feminism, given that neoliberalism has remade the world, both within the welfare states of the North and the developmental states of the South. Like David Harvey, this transnational vision elides some of the complex and contested battles through which the global South and the North today appear to converge, eliding the political defeat of a third world internationalist vision, something that lays the groundwork for the global governance paradigm and its productive use of gender. Feminists speaking in and through the third world who engaged this international system in the 1970s and 80s struggled to get this international system to understand the centrality of women from the third world for the development process. However, this project got entangled with the fluid dynamics and struggles of decolonization and the rise of neoliberal thinking and policy. The defeat of the Third World Project coincided with the emergence of the woman question in the international system in ways that ambivalently undid the sovereign equality of nations. While a Southern feminist position on neoliberalism and structural adjustment, articulated in and through a third world internationalist vision framed by non-alignment, clearly failed. This failure might help us to reframe contemporary narratives of success, whether it is about development or gender, in ways that provide new resources for rethinking. However this reimagining happens, a more complex understanding of the rise of a global gender discourse, the emergence of neoliberalism, and the end of the Third World Project might help us to move beyond denunciation or narrow understandings of what works and what does not towards a more critical apprehension of our present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritty. Yeah. So if you have questions, I would welcome you to either write it in the comment box or speak. Anu, over to you now.
Thanks. Let me start by responding to the talk briefly and then taking questions. Thank you, Ritty. It was so very interesting to see it come together. I have heard different iterations of this in our conversations we've had. I've had some sense of what this was. The canvas is huge and quite formidable. There are many parallel kinds of strains that you are identifying in order to actually make and unmake certain ways of thinking about specificities of the local. So that's not often easy to do, and so and therefore also sort of raising questions of this. So I was happy that you moved away from the there's an older kind of sort of speaking about the 70s moment, particularly within the women and gender kind of framing in terms of the with GAD. All of that. So I'm happy that that was shelved quite nicely and we didn't have to go into that because that's really quite, it's been done to death in a sense. I want to draw your attention to 2 or 3 things. I mean, I'm interested to hear more. One is the question of neoliberalism. When one thinks about the ways in which state forms themselves are changing, right? The nation state itself is changing in this period. Right? So we are also thinking about a time, and that's not surprising. I mean, these are parallel processes in different parts of the world. If we're thinking about the 70s through to 2000s, we are also seeing the Indian states. I mean, we have to, much as we want to think about Kerala as a nation, but that aside, there's a way in which, the Indian nation states changing character and the way in which neoliberalism is globally a phenomenon to which there are different kinds of responses from this end. And one of those, in its very early moments, is the parallel process of the 90s of Indian liberalization and globalization that's actually happening in this period, which I think might be useful to put that into this framing while we think about the ways in which neoliberalism becomes a kind of framework against which one might want to think about what's happening. So if I was to speak from 2021 Kerala with a left front government, I would say I find it deeply neoliberal. But at the same time, from the 1970s through the 90s, one mightn't have found it to be so. So there is an interesting shift in the nature of the Indian state and the nature of local kinds of adjustments to and the ways in which the neoliberal, particularly in its sort of economic form and sometimes in its status form, has been so internalized that it becomes an intelligible script for states to work with. So much so that what was very striking when Kerala went into its elections this time is that, I mean, all over the country we've seen this. The term that's used is Vikas or Vigasanam. Development was the grounds on which repeatedly governments go to elections, right? So there is something very enduring about that, and we need to think about that. So I'm with you on this question of what does it mean to return to development again and again. We may want to do it in a decennial way, we may want to do it in another kind of way, we may want to do it as part of changing political rhetoric, but there is something quite fascinating about the manner in which development is repeatedly invoked. So a kind of repetition with a difference kind of thing. So one might want to actually think about the way in which these two come together. And I say that because I think in many respects, in fact, what's actually exceedingly significant to think about in the context of Kerala is that when we think about it from today's point of view, when we think about these last 5 decades, from the 70s through to now, what's actually really very striking is the other sort of issue which you mentioned very briefly, but I think we need to sort of place here up front, which is a remittance economy, right? So there is a way in which one has to think about the Kerala model in the context of a remittance economy, which from the 80s becomes a reality. And it is now that the bubble is sort of bursting. But what one can say quite safely is that even till last year or the year before last, when one looks at the kinds of figures of what was being remitted to Kerala, it is staggering, in terms of what it actually means for Kerala's economy. And therefore, many of the kinds of economic decisions that are being made here, the kinds of shifts that are actually happening, are very deeply linked with that kind of international, right? So there is a world of the UN that you have mapped very beautifully. You have also sort of spoken, I mean, through the neoliberal, you've spoken about the World Bank, and, there's a kind of referencing of that. There is that unstructural adjustments. But I think that, this is an aspect we need to actually take on very centrally. What does left developmentalism mean in the face of a remittance economy? How do we speak about the social and whatever Kerala's gains are in relation to an economic model which is completely not in sync with this and has a different rhythm altogether? So it's not even Gujarat or any other part of the country for that matter, or Bengal. I mean, this is a very different kind of set of indices, I think, that we have to take on board quite seriously, and I think we may want to think about that. And finally, let me just stop my present set of comments for the moment on this. I think the equity question is a really significant one, because from different kinds of pushbacks, equity is something that has been critiqued, and as your own earlier work, which engaged with so many kinds of forms of pushback to something like this. What does caste and caste discrimination and caste inequality mean? When one speaks about equity, it has, where is the place of thinking about caste when one thinks about equity? So I think the question here for us, listening to what you were framing, and which I think is extremely important, which is, how does one actually speak to the new forms of perhaps inchoate, perhaps not added up together, but new kinds of forms of social and political assertion that we find from hitherto unrepresented groups within the story, which is lower caste men and women, Muslims in Kerala, Dalit Christians. How do we actually speak to that story of assertion, which actually lays claim to certain kinds of things of an older framing of equity? One part of it is that, it's trying to reclaim rights to, freedom and agency, perhaps articulated in that old sense, right? What I'm not putting into the fray right now, but again, at some point one will want to think about this, is also the growth of Hindutva in Kerala. So, but let's keep that for another time. So these are the kinds of things that I thought struck me as really very significant, and things that we might want to open up. I want to just end by saying, which you know only too well, we are speaking at a time with no paddies, literally, with Kerala sinking, an extraordinarily scary environmental crisis that we witness on a daily basis. Nandan is here with us today. Hopefully he will have something to say to us about that. But it's a scary, scary moment. So, people have said that Kerala will start drowning within a very short time. So, we are speaking about Kerala from a very different vantage point in that sense too. Climate change is something that we have to now factor in, whatever else we're discussing. Oh, all right, let me stop. And Ekita has raised her hand for a very long time now. What I want to ask Navneeta and Papuri is, are people supposed to type in the questions, or are they being asked to?
So I think first maybe Ritty could respond to your comments.
Yeah, let me just
and then,
respond a little, and we can. So thanks, Anu. Absolutely. I guess let me just frame. I took out various aspects of this talk to fit the time frame. But one of the things I wanted to that I originally had in the talk was the way in which my first book, in some sense, was precisely asking the question of what a remittance economy means in the context of the trajectories of left developmentalism in Kerala, right? And what does it mean to pay attention to that notion of the international and iterations of international political economy, the circulation of commodity cultures, et cetera, in relationship to the ways in which gender development, et cetera, get framed and talked about within the Kerala context, right? And of course, I'm part of many people sitting here, Navneeta, you, Anu, many other people that tried to problematize in one way or another the Kerala model framing, right? I guess this project kind of comes out of the fact that for me, this 1975 report, I use, as many other people do, as a placeholder for what the Kerala model literature is and does. But I felt I never really understood how it came to be, right? And so the very simple question here is how did it come to be? And just simply mapping that as a way of trying to better understand those trajectories of left developmentalism in Kerala, where I think the international dimensions of it are not often or adequately paid attention to. So absolutely, I think that the trajectories of developmentalism in Kerala have been massively reframed through remittance trajectories and so on. But I do think that the ways in which we internalize ideas about what our neoliberal present is partly what I'm interested in. I think there are ways in which we forget, right, that the end of the Third World Project is part of the neoliberal present that we inhabit. But in the ways in which we talk about the transnational, whether it's transnationalism within anthropology or transnationalism within feminism, et cetera, I think we forget some of those histories. And what would it mean for rethinking the conundrums that we find ourselves in today, to remember the end of the Third World Project as something ambivalently produced in and through the circulation of the woman question within the international system, right? And so that's sort of what I'm wrestling with, which is in some sense the absolute prehistory of what is going on in Kerala today. But I do think that some of those framings still operate in the way that people talk about governmentalized feminism in Kerala, right? Even in the contemporary context. And I think you're also absolutely right to draw attention to the ways in which development is persistently invoked, right? As you put it nicely, repetition with a difference, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is in some sense recover the ways in which development was talked about under other framings, in which one could talk about different styles of development, et cetera. And what does it mean that we can no longer do so, right? And so that's partly the ways in which I'm trying to think about this repetition with a difference in order to, so that we, as we sit in our neoliberal present, can actually recognize how our horizons have been shaped by the fact that other ideas about development have been defeated, right? And that's partly my problem with the kind of argument that Jim Ferguson is making, right? We've so narrowed our horizons of possibility that now all we want to talk about is is this good policy, is this bad policy, is this, does this have some purchase, does it not, does it provide some agency to some women, that kind of engagement with the ways in which we think about the impact of neoliberalism now. And as far as new forms of social assertion in Kerala, this was also a part of the talk that I had to take out. One of the things I tried to discuss in the larger paper is the ways in which the governmentalization of feminism or the governmentalization of development in Kerala absolutely doesn't mean the absence of contestations, right? In fact, it's the conditions of possibility for democratic contestation. And it is precisely Dalit, Adivasi, sex worker, and other kinds, other land struggles, et cetera, that are challenging the parameters of the Kerala model as it's articulated through its state-centric version, right? And I think it is perhaps drawing on some of the language of equity, freedom, agency within that model that is being used to contest the limits, the exclusions, et cetera, of the Kerala model, right? So these were just some thoughts that came to mind as I was engaging you. Thank you. So we move to.
So far I see just one question.
Yes, yeah. There's a question from Umakant who asks, I'm interested in drawing your attention to the people living on the margins, i.e. the Dalits, Adivasis, Lukas, Muslims, etc. In this context, how do you explain Kerala land struggle and its relation with Kerala model? It is good to talk about substantive freedom and not much attention is paid on substantive equality.
Yeah, so I think that's related to what I was just trying to suggest, that in no way is my critique of Sen and his ideas of freedom and agency, empowerment, etc., intended to, in some sense, elide the ways in which those can become productive concepts and sources of mobilization. But I am interested, and I think it's important for us to pay attention to the ways in which that language is shaped by the shifting horizons of alternative possibilities, right? That are given to us and not given to us, right? And so I think that language can circulate in lots of different and productive ways. But I guess I'm interested in mapping that top-down story for us to think about the relationship between that and the ways in which people are mobilizing that language for struggle in the contemporary context.
There's another question from Aparna Ishwaran. She says, fascinating lecture, thank you. Kerala's engagement with public health as well as its treatment of internal migrants, that is guest workers, figure in this forming of it as a model in the present. Can this also be placed in the history you talk of?
I think so. I mean, definitely the issue of internal migrants is a relatively newer phenomena. And to the extent that I think that the Kerala model literature is used to frame the way that the state engages different kinds of constituencies, absolutely yes. And there's a lot of, I think there are a lot of ways in which the histories of the way that the state has dealt with rights claims that are made on the state is a very persistent feature of the Kerala model, right? Which has, in some sense, produced a far more capacious and inclusionary way in which some of these issues are dealt with. My point here is not to suggest that somehow the Kerala model framing doesn't do work on the ground. I'm interested in us paying attention to how it functions within different historical periods. So if it emerges in the 1970s as an alternative in a contested battle about socialism versus capitalism, etc., I think in the contemporary period, given the post-89 context, we have a very different framing, right? Certainly, I think now, given the ways in which I think the discourse about neoliberalism is shifting, right? And we understand that, some people talk about that we're at the end of the neoliberal era. Biden certainly has many people in the US animated by the idea of a new era of social democracy and so on. How do we think about those alternatives? And how do we remember earlier iterations of socialism, et cetera, in relationship to the kinds of things that people are trying to forge today? Answer that question.
I think Malirika has a question.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Ritty. I'm really sorry I missed the first 4 minutes of the talk.
Okay. How are you?
Thank you for asking. As the pandemic leaves us, surviving.
Yeah.
So thank you for the wonderful talk. And I just wanted to, because I read on your earlier work on the remittance economy and the changing Kerala youth culture and how it is shaping the contemporary aspects of, including the ideas of speciality in several ways. So what I am, interested in going back to the question of remittance in terms of the region, that the manner in which you have been mapping Kerala with, the way it's usually linked with Sri Lanka and the way China is also referred to in a particular sense that Sen is doing. And, the other socialist histories of developmentalism. And in that, how are you actually trying to, map that kind of transnationalism where the specter of Cuba is there, the questions regarding Vietnam's experience of developmentalism and then encounters with neoliberalism, the way Kerala is put in that particular trajectory of transnationalism, how would you like to think about it? And second is the way I was just wondering about development right now as such a contested space. Of course, equity becomes one, and the question of growth versus sustainable development the manners in which that discourse gets shaped up. I was just wondering about in terms of the term gender mainstreaming becoming popularized and how the question of human rights and violence against women become really central notions of shaping the discourse of developmentalism, especially around the question of gender. And how are you, thinking through that particular idea of development and equity and violence? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So let me talk a little bit about Kerala as region in relationship to other examples of socialist development around the world, Vietnam, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, so part of what I was interested in is the anomaly that Kerala is in that context, right? It is not a sovereign nation. And in some sense, one can hear even Amartya Sen feeling like he has to account for that in some way, right? And part of what I'm exploring is the way in which the non-sovereign character of Kerala as a region within a nation actually makes it particularly productive, right, in international developmentalist frameworks, especially within a kind of comparativist grid, as a way of putting forth alternative policy prescriptions without having to take on the actual possibility of sovereignty gained through a certain kind of revolutionary trajectory, right? And so part of what I'm trying to explore is once that international developmentalist grid starts expanding from GNP to PQLI to HDI, et cetera, right? Where the north, south, east, west grammar of that comparativist grid is kind of laid down through competing nations and their different models of development, right? I think the kind of socialist inspired, but not properly socialist, right? Development experience within Kerala becomes something that circulates within that system to do different kinds of work, right? So if you look at the work that it does within Sen's argument, Kerala is extremely important in making an argument against China, right? Because Kerala has democracy, China does not, right? In Sen's articulation, right? And so it's that kind of slipperiness, I think, about Kerala within that broader context that I think is interesting to note, and that we should think about how its regional non-sovereign character gives it a particular productivity within that terrain, right? Now, the really interesting question you raise about human rights and violence against women. And in the early part of the talk, I very quickly tried to suggest that one highly schematic way of understanding the kind of post-war woman question within the international system is to recognize that it has had two dominant iterations, right? One, development, and two, violence against women, right? And I think very broadly and very schematically, one can suggest that it is development that emerged as the dominant framework in the 1970s and 80s. And it is in the 1990s that, in a sense, the dominant paradigm shifts from development to violence against women, right? And that's sort of this broad framing that I have. Now, the question that you raise is, of course, what are the mutual imbrications between these two paradigms within the ongoing unfolding of this in our contemporary period? And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not that the dominant framing of development goes away. I mean, in and through the 1990s, it essentially gets neoliberalized. Through development gets neoliberalized through things like microfinance, microcredit, et cetera, et cetera. So that itself is an ongoing mutation of that system. But of course, as different kinds of people will talk about, in the UN systems, starting in the 1990s, if you were interested in access to water and tube wells in villages, it was a hard sell. Whereas torture, rape, etc., had purchase within the system, right? And so I do think that there's a kind of important shift to note, but obviously these things are also mutually imbricated, right? And questions of equity and access, in some sense, frame both paradigms, right? And I think it's an interesting question to think about what happens to those concepts under these different regimes of knowledge within this global infrastructure of gender, right? Now, my project is, because I didn't feel I could take on what started to happen in the 1990s, is very focused on the question of development, and sort of ends in the middle 80s, Dawn and its intervention in the 1985 Nairobi conference and so on. And I don't take up in the project itself what happens to these two and how they relate to each other. But I think that is a really an important dimension of what's going on now. Other questions? Anu, I can't hear
You're muted, Anu. You're muted.
Sorry. I put in a quote from Pinarayi Vijayan's article today, which ANI has tweeted. I thought it might be interesting because he's fighting about the Kerala model. He says that if Kerala model is wrong in COVID containment, then which model should we follow? the thing about this present moment of enormous attack on Kerala for very predictable reasons is that one willy-nilly ends up becoming unnecessarily defensive about things that we don't necessarily defend anyway. Yeah. But so
no, I mean, I always find myself I always find myself having to apologize for any critique that I have of the Kerala model.
I know.
Especially in sort of left circles and international forums, right? I mean, it's very difficult to sort of sustain it and at least ask for some critical attention to it. Given,
but even more difficult when you're speaking to a largely right audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you aren't speaking to them, but sort of speaking. Anyway, Umakant has come back with another question. He asks, could you explain how intersectionality is involved in gender mainstreaming? Kudumbashree is hailed as a successful model of women's empowerment. But please enlighten us about other women-specific intervention by the state.
Intersectionality. Maybe I'll come at that tangentially by talking a little bit about how the question of intersectionality emerged in some of the texts and folks that I'm talking about. And then maybe that will lead to trying to think about the question of intersectionality as it's framed by this broader discourse and what it might mean within a local context. So one of the interesting things about the engagements between American, European, and Eastern European, Southern feminists, I think is very much the question, is very much a notion of intersectionality framed within an internationalist context, right? So one of the standard lines of debate in the 1970s within feminist circles was the way in which American feminists, for example, would want to talk about man-woman, right? Women's subordination, male oppression, right? And it was feminists from the global south and from a third world context who were like, that is not a framing that enables us to think about the context within which we live and work and struggle and operate, right? And so pushing back against the idea of a kind of universalizing notion of women's oppression, and women's subordination. A lot of the interventions, and you could see this in the very contested debates starting in 1975 in Mexico City with the first women's conference, right? The conjuring up of the category of women in that conference was the moment of its disillusionment, right? I mean, and so, Betty Friedan is talking about women's subordination, male oppression, was severely critiqued by those who wanted to talk about colonialism, imperialism, the condition of women in the third world, etc. Right? So there, in some sense, there's a kind of internationalist trajectory of the question of intersectionality that hinges on one's location within a national context that reverberates through these debates. Now, that is obviously a very different iteration of the question of intersectionality than the ways in which one might think about it within any national context, or in terms of race, caste, Adivasi identities, et cetera, right? But I think it's important, particularly at this moment when, the idea of intersectionality is sort of circulating globally, to recognize some of these other histories of the way in which those questions were animated through the trajectories of struggles around third worldism, et cetera, and what that might mean for the ways in which we think about where we're getting our concepts of intersectionality from, what purchase they have, what we do with them within local contexts, and so on, right? I mean, I think there is some sense that it's being imposed from on high, right, in some sense. There's definitely a grassroots engagement with the question of intersectionality. One could argue that in many ways, lots of different feminisms around the world were always already intersectional in different ways, and not intersectional enough in other ways, right? And so I think trying to open up what the transnational is in and through these alternative trajectories of intersectionality might be very productive for trying to think about how we talk about that term in the here and now. That's one thing I'm kind of trying to think about as I revisit these texts and these figures and some of these discourses.
Anu, Navanita has a question, I think. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ritty. That's like, it's really great to see how all these trajectories are coming together, So I think my question is slightly in a different direction, and, like it might not be within the scope of what you're taking on now, but because you clearly said you want to look at the top down and, how these institutional structures are working. But I was also thinking that in the same time period, right, like how would the story look if we look at sources that are coming from within the region itself, right? Like, because, that quote of, where, you said, right, like that Amartya Sen is making, it's Kerala's pride in some ways, right? Like, so I was also wondering, I mean, not just in the 70s, like how when we look at a certain, a kind of official discourse of feminism within Kerala itself, right? Like through writings, through pamphlets or documents that, feminism itself is putting forward, right? What kind of how is this internationalism being sieved through, right? And what are the elisions? Like, because some of the problems that you're saying, right, like that whole question of land, for example, right, like that, or employment, right, like those, how they are also never the mainstream feminism's questions, at least at that point of time, in the way they're coming up more recently, right? Like, and how then, in some senses, there seems to be some reverberations of that even in the present. I mean, it's interesting to see how Kerala as a state is ready to sometimes embrace certain modes of agency that, like say, for example, the transgender question, how that has become one of the ways in which the sexuality issue can be addressed in the Kerala context, right? Like the state support for gender transition operations, so a particular mode in which then feminism is even today, modeled, I would say, right? Like, so would that, so if how would that be part of, clearly you are saying it's part of this story, right? Like, so would that materials then, push your argument forward in another kind of direction too? I mean, I'm just wondering. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, one of the ways in which I came to this project was partly about trying to step back in a way. I mean, this project very much comes from the ways in which, in the contemporary context, people have been wrestling with, activists, scholars, right? How to think the local, the national, the global, right? And the lines of influence, the lines of co-optation, the lines of productive possibilities, right? And I definitely feel like the category transgender is an excellent example of that, right? And we have tons and tons of ethnographic work from around the world wrestling with, women's organizations in northeastern Brazil and its relationship to the institutions, discourses, and practices of transnational feminism as it comes to us from the UN system, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm absolutely with you on the fact that there's a huge complexity to the ways in which the local, the national, the global are imbricated in complex ways in the ways in which questions of sex and gender are being dealt with today, right? And there's a lot of fine work that does that. And in some sense, the project that I could have done after I sort of did my first work might have gone in that direction, right? I guess part of what stopped me from going in that direction was feeling like there have to be better ways of reframing the anxieties that shape the ways in which we talk about these imbrications of the contemporary period. Are there things that we could better understand about how the ground shifted in the 70s and the 80s that might help us to rethink and reframe the ways in which, say, sexuality rights activists, feminists on the ground are dealing with, neoliberal restructurings of different kinds that produce new forms of productive possibility, as well as new forms of incorporation, assimilation, etc. And that's really where this project came from, was a desire to sort of step back from that and sort of just ask a question about whether a remapping and a recovery, in a sense, of some of the visions that animated the gender and development paradigm might actually be important to think about, right? I mean, look, we all now roll our eyes in some sense at the women in development paradigm, right? We understand the kind of ossification and the kind of policy prescriptions and the institutionalization that it is, right? And I think that as Anu said, we've gone through all the different policy shifts and done it ad nauseum, right? But part of what I feel like we haven't paid sufficient attention to are the contestations, the scholarly and political visions that animated that international intervention in the first place, and in some sense, trying to better understand what happened to it, such that we are where we are now, right? So if you think about, for example, Chandra Mohanty's, critique of the way that Western feminism has constructed the third world woman, obviously that's a very seminal and important critique, right? But there is nothing about the end of the third world project in the way in which that story is told, right? And I think that we need to understand that in relationship to the way that the third world woman gets configured now within Western discourse, right? And so that's sort of where some of this project comes from. And obviously there's a lot going on in the national and regional context that I'm not paying attention to in this project. Obviously the Indian women's movement in the 1970s is itself a very complicated thing, shaped by disillusionment with the state through the emergency, all kinds of things, right? And the figures that turned international, in some sense, were highly specific figures who were positioned in very complicated ways, right? Who in some sense had more purchase internationally than they sometimes did nationally. But be that as it may, that they were important players in the shifting of the discourse that then returned, right, to the national and the regional to shape the context within which people are adjudicating and struggling with the linkages between region, nation, and globe. And that's sort of where the kind of, that's what animates this project in some sense.
Okay, I have a quick question, Anu. Can I ask?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ritty. So I was just wondering, in terms of what you just commented on. So in terms of, and this was not part of your talk today, but in terms of how are you reading Kumari Jayawardene, right? In terms of the idea of internationalism that she had, right, coming from the perspective of the third world. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes. So one of the things that really interests me about Kumari and Kumari's work is that book emerged from a set of lectures that Kumari gave when she was at The Hague. And Maria Mies asked her to teach a course on women and development. And that course on women and development was an extremely important moment in the institutionalization, scholarly institutionalization of the women and development paradigm. And many practitioners of development all over the third world went through that MA course and then went off to do women and development around the world, right? And so it then became, her lecture notes became the book, right? Now, what's interesting about that is that it was written in the late 70s, early 80s. It was written in the early 80s. And I've interviewed Kumari about the writing of this book. And one of the things she talks about is how horrified she was by the women in development paradigm. Now, some of it comes from, is disciplinary in the sense that she's a political scientist. The women in development paradigm was kind of shaped by sociology, development economics, demography, right? She also considers herself a Marxist feminist, right? And so her way of teaching women and development in 1982 in The Hague is to have her students remember that there were feminist struggles in their countries of origin, that they fought imperialism, that they struggled for national liberation. And it was a deeply internationalist, left Marxist framework, right, that animated that book, right? But I think it's important to recognize that in a sense, it was a reaction formation to the rise of the women in development paradigm, right? And so I see that book as a moment of critique in the trajectory of the women in development paradigm as it's being institutionalized in the 1970s into the early 80s, and a kind of interruption, a kind of questioning about whether there's another kind of internationalist vision about women rooted in third world national liberation struggles that could animate the ways that women in the third world are configured internationally, as opposed to what is happening through the women and development paradigm. Right. So I've done some archival work. And so if you look at the syllabus for earlier iterations of the course and when Kumari taught it, it's very different. And so I sort of see that text as a very interesting revision or critique of this paradigm as it's emerging, evolving, institutionalizing, etc. Yeah.
There's also this question of the creation of a unipolar world with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of, the Eastern Bloc politically, the changes that are actually happening. Because in many ways, as you did, Mark, specifically speak about the Bandung moment, but Bandung also needs to be understood within that kind of larger world. You couldn't have had that kind of coming together at that moment because a lot of these countries, that's the interesting thing about the way in which Marxism had a certain kind of meaning in the third world context. It was so differently articulated. That's why national liberation movements could be understood also variously as socialist and Marxist and so on and so forth and all of that. So there's something quite interesting about that whole phenomenon. And from the Kerala perspective, I mean, the relationship specifically to Russia and China, perhaps not other parts of the, Eastern Bloc, is really very interesting because you had students being sent off to Patrice Lumumba and, there's so much of all of that was actually happening. So there's a very, very interesting kind of way in which particular kinds of the presence of certain countries, certain libraries, certain contexts produced a kind of international which came with a prehistory but was reconfigured because the 1970s or 80s understood it in a certain kind of way. So I think
I think there's a lot of interesting and very exciting work being done now to within different kinds of international histories of feminism to trace those things, right? So, for example, Kristen Godsey's work on sort of Eastern feminism, its role within, and for example, the relationship between the Soviet system and the third world is its own history, right? That has its own articulations. I mean, one of the reasons that I have chosen the figures that I've chosen, Esther Boserup, Maria Mies, Kumari Jayawardena, Dawn, is very, for me, very interestingly, they all started out working in one way or another in South Asia, right? And so Esther Boserup did most of her work on women in agricultural labor, and then, in a sense, went international. Maria Mies did the same. Kumari Jayawardena is, in some sense, coming from Sri Lanka, going to The Hague, asking questions about that international system. And in these interviews that I've done with her, she is very she refuses the idea that she had anything to do with the international system. Because she was a Marxist in Sri Lanka, even though she was at the Copenhagen meeting, she was at, et cetera, right? And Dawn obviously had a much broader global South vision, but its first meeting was in 1984 in Bangalore, right? And so I am trying to, in a sense, trace a particular trajectory that moves from South Asia to the international. But obviously there are other trajectories that were in and through which one could tell the story. And there's really interesting work coming out of, say, Bulgaria, and so on, that looks at some of these connections, or different Latin American contexts, African contexts, Black feminist internationalism from the U.S. That has a third worldist component, etc. And so I think there's a lot to understand about the different strands of this moment as it comes together.
Any other questions, comments?
Just to kind of add to what, it's very exciting the way you are tracing it, that I very recently interviewed someone who has been part of the Nairobi conference as part of WIDF.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
So,
I also was part of it.
Yes.
Look at it. How wonderful. Yes, and that entire trajectory of Mexico, Copenhagen, and Nairobi, and the way it travels, the Women's World Conference's travel. So, and I had this opportunity to interview someone who participated there. So, some of the stories are really very interesting, the way the gender and development agenda gets shaped, especially in Nairobi being such a momentous conference also.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it Julia Alcott's book on the 75 Mexico City conference is a wonderful book on sort of how the entanglements of all these different strands come together in that moment. Yeah.
But it's very interesting. This question of the national is such a difficult one to, I think one needs to unpack that with care, because there's a way in which, for example, in the 70s and early 80s, when Malarika brought this up, I was reminded of Iranian women who had come. And the way in which the nation made sense to them was very different from, let's say, the more kind of, after all, India had been through 3.5 decades or whatever it was by then, almost 4 decades were over of independence. So the sort of context of critique was so much stronger for at least a younger generation of Indian within that context, a critique of the nation,
of the nation,
as opposed to somebody else for whom the national referenced a certain kind of identity making of a different kind, or let's say in the Palestinian context, an aspiration and a dream. So, it's such a difficult thing of, how one works with this. And I think the contemporary moment reminds us more and more of how careful one needs to be, because one's location determines so strongly how we think about it. And I'm not saying that one shouldn't have one's positions. Obviously, it's our context that's going to determine that. But I think in the larger thing of, when we frame it, the question is, where do we enter it from?
Right. No, I think that's absolutely a very crucial question that played itself out, interestingly, in formations like Dawn, right? Because you had people coming from India, you had Fatima Mernissi in Morocco, you had Peggy Antropos in Barbados, these are very differently positioned nation states within the international system. And some of those things played itself out within the tensions within Dawn, right? And so I think that is a very important thing. One of the things that very early on, very simply, in a sense, made me turn to some of these questions is the way in which in some of the contemporary debates that I was encountering, right, there's this, the global is pitted against the national, right? It's this predatory global that is impinging itself on local feminisms and national, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the interesting things about revisiting some of these folk who are writing and thinking and active in the 70s and 80s, is that there was no paradox or contradiction between the national and the international, right? Because of a certain kind of third world internationalist vision, right? And so now that wasn't true universally across the globe, but certainly some sense that one was in some sense representing one's nation when you went to Mexico City. And you were doing so in a way that was certainly critical of the nation state that you belonged to, otherwise you wouldn't be in Mexico City, right? But in some sense, a spokesperson for that nation,
country,
etc. Right? And so I think that it's interesting to think about those kinds of histories in terms of the ways in which ideas about the global get discussed and calibrated and debated in our contemporary debates, right? Or for that matter, the way in which the term transnational, right, emerges as a way I would argue, at least in some of the things that I'm engaging, in a sense to flatten, create a kind of argument about convergence on a global scale, without recognizing some of the histories that might have gotten us to this moment of convergence, right? Which is the other strand that I'm also trying to think about in this project.
I don't think we have any more questions.
Okay.
All right. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think with that we can conclude. Thank you so much, Ritty, and thank you so much, Anu. This was amazing. And I think it gives us a way of thinking about the transnational with inputs from our location in the global south. So we're looking forward to your work in the future. Yeah, in writing. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your questions, and it was great. Lots to think about. Okay.
Everybody is invited to the nation of Kerala for a holiday.
And the sovereign nation.
It's God's own country anyways.
I'm actually going to a grocery store in New Jersey to get my beef curry and parota tomorrow.